Good morning. Nampo 2024 is here, and this is the 14th year of Nation and Conversation, where we create content for all the different platforms, and we also try and enlighten topical issues. Landbou is nie vir sissies nie. En Suid-Afrika is nie vir die faint-hearted nie. Ons is uitsonderlike mense. Ek het vanmôre weer vir iemand gesê, in the exposure in Germany, the one thing that struck me is that our young people are extraordinary. You must always remember that. Our future is in good hands. We have good young people. So enjoy today. Enjoy the week of conversation. This is a conversation, not a debate. And the difference is, in a debate, you don't change your standpoint. In a conversation, you listen to somebody else, and that enriches your own standpoint. It's important. So geniet vandag. Ons het 'n baie lekker topic. Baie dankie ook vir ons borge. Ons het uitstaande borge. Hulle sal op die borde verskyn. They've come with us for a long way. So we're going to start with an intro to give you context, and then only to you on your panel, your esteemed panel. En ons het net sulke goeie gehoorlede. As julle mense kan elkeen laat opstaan en net bietjie sê wat doen julle? You'll be amazed of who is in the room. So thank you, and we look forward to it.
South African agriculture is not a world in and of itself. It's part of the global economy. And as such, it's impacted by global events, risks, uncertainties, and trends. Global themes like climate change, geopolitical tensions, global market fluctuations, and supply chain disruptions all impact agriculture here in South Africa.
South Africa's agriculture has seen enormous improvement over time. Today, we are the 32nd largest agricultural exporter in the world. We export over half of what we produce in value terms. Just in 2023, that was about $13.2 billion, a record figure. But we've also seen this sector contributing significantly in improving household food security. We are now the leading food secure country in the sub-Saharan Africa region. In Africa, we're the second most food secure country. But of course, in today's environment where geopolitics are becoming part and parcel of our everyday life, that export exposure that we have does mean that we have to pay attention on what we do in the world, and our foreign policy has to also be conscious to our economic interest in the world. This progress that South Africa's agriculture has seen have actually been a global dividend. We've seen improvement in productivity because of the technology and the research that is done elsewhere in the world. And the South African businesses and the government have been open to adopting that technology across all of our value chains, which is why today we can confidently say we are part of the global agricultural village.
But just as the uncertainties have a ripple effect, reaching local producers and agribusinesses, the ways in which our international counterparts adapt to these conditions can also offer us valuable insights and solutions. There is so much we can learn from global trends about integrating change-driven technology, adapting to challenges, and building resilience into production methods and business models.
Sorghum is really a good crop for crop rotation. In the no-till system, it's working really good. Depending on a good root system of sorghum, it's drought tolerant. The crop is really underestimated. It's really good in nutrient value and low GI. There's a growing market for that in the future. With awareness at the consumer, that will expand the market for that. After the big growth in maize and soyas internationally, with the GM gene that's coming in, there's a lot of pressure at the sorghum crop in the world. But it's turning around. The whole process of worldwide climate change and the quality of the crop sorghum. There's a lot of growth with new type of varieties that come in, and it will become more profitable in the future. So I'm looking forward for a bright future in the sorghum industry.
There is also much to be learned from global trade patterns about increasing our own market access.
If we think about agriculture exports and the implication for agriculture production in South Africa, we can think about the value that exports offer for additional growth. So South African agriculture production is growing much faster than what we can locally consume. So we need to grow export markets. So we're looking at about 40 to 50% of the local agriculture production is being exported. And there are markets that are growing faster. We see, for example, expansion in China. We see expansion in the Middle East. Those markets offer significant opportunity for further exports. What does it mean? What is the implication of this? First of all, it creates resilience in our local system. So we have much bigger markets to produce, to export into. So it creates this pool of additional production. So through that we can create jobs, we can create opportunities. Secondly, it requires much finer alignment between private sector and government. And thirdly, it has a big implication for infrastructure. We need to improve our ports, we need to improve our road and our infrastructure that we can export more into the future.
These strategies for adaptation and resilience are essential for the survival of our farmers and agribusinesses. We cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for attending this first session of Nation in Conversation. And I think what Wandile said, we are all part of the global agricultural village, is quite profound if you think that each one of us, no matter the role you play in agriculture, the very fact that you're here today means you are interested and invested in agriculture, whether you're here with us physically in the audience or whether you're watching streaming online. Each one who has a passion and an interest in agriculture is connected in some small way to all of the other people across the globe who are invested in agriculture. And the ability to learn from each other and to form these connected systems of adaptation and resilience makes us all so much stronger. So in welcoming you, I'd also like to welcome our panel today. I suppose I should introduce myself as well. I'm Annelie Hutting. I am, for my sins, a news anchor on ENCA, but I am also working in the agricultural sector with Brand Republic. So I'm learning each day a little bit more about the world that you are also invested in, and it's an absolute privilege. To my left is Johan Coetzee, the new CEO of AgriSA. Johan, when do we stop calling you the new CEO? By the end of the year, or?
No, we can stop.
We can stop.
It doesn't feel new anymore.
There's much to do. To his left, Corné Louw from Grain SA. Corné, baie dankie dat jy ook vandag by ons is.
Nice being here, thank you.
Dewald Olivier from Red Meat Industry Services. Dankie vir jou ook, Dewald. En Annika de Beer, a meteorologist. Thank goodness I could say that. Sometimes it's a bit of a tongue twister. And from Restore Africa. Dankie Annika dat jy ook by ons is vandag.
Baie dankie. Dis lekker om hier te wees.
So we're going to kick off today by talking, and the point of today's discussion is talking big picture, looking further than our shores, looking at these big factors that influence South African agriculture and global agriculture, and seeing how they impact us and how we can learn from them. And I want to start with you, Johan. If you could just take us some of those. We've seen a lot of the themes in that scene setter video, but if you could just sum up for us, what are the big things we're looking at?
Firstly, I need to say that I don't hope that 2024 becomes the norm for the world, because I think we go into a very extreme. We have 64 countries going to polls, of which the EU, I think, is for us the most significant one going there. The geopolitical conflict is a big one, Hamas, the Hamas conflict, and then I think the Ukraine-Russia conflict has a great impact on us. Then something that we also picked up, maybe more on the grain side of it, is the COVID-19 pandemic is not over. Although it's over, the aftermath and I would say the adoption to what didn't work is still vivid in our supply chain. So that's quite a big one. But the most important thing and the most important trend, I think, sits with weather. We have a planetary emergency on climate change. Yeah. And it has a major impact in the global agricultural world. Before we talk about two trends out of the climate change one, maybe just a comment on we entering an era of deglobalization, which it's frightening because we just started to get used to globalization. All of a sudden, there's something different. It's not made in China anymore. It's now made in Canada. It's now made in USA. There's a big focus on regional concepts. I think the second thing is agriculture. If we're not going to be resilient to change, we're not going to make it. So we need to say that before we start a conversation of what climate change is going to be. And then I think maybe the most important one is we need pragmatic leadership. And meaning that we need to create a food system that is more resilient. It needs to be more forceful in a sense when we have a change that we would be able to adopt to the change and not only survive but also thrive in the change. One concept about I would say, the climate change that's coming is the major focus on sustainability. And it imposes a lot of risk, a lot of good, but also a lot of risk because of the misinterpretation thereof. So I think for us in South Africa, it's not that we can exclude ourselves and say we're in Africa. We experience it all through the value chain that we deal with in agriculture, and it has a major impact on us. I'm going to say it again, we can't hide from it. We need to learn and create this resilience in agriculture to overcome and to thrive in a very difficult and changing situation.
I don't think many of us really realize the extent to which COVID impacted how we think and feel about things. COVID isolated us. People were trapped in their homes or their immediate environments. You had to think of survival of yourself and your family unit first, protection from other people, focusing inwards. And then because of the damage to supply chains, when that focus shifted outward again, we stayed a little bit selfish. And I think that happens in family units, in town units, in country units as well. And that protectionism that we're seeing now where, countries want to protect their own trade routes above other countries. And in terms of climate change, we're thinking local as well. What can I do on my farm? But we really need to open up that perspective and look globally, because that is a responsibility that none of us can carry alone or can shirk. It's either going to be a collective effort or it's not going to work. On that point, I want to come to you, Annika. There's a lot of talk about 1.5 or 1%, 2% climate change in degrees.
Yes.
Why is it so critical for us to stay beneath that level?
I think that's a really great question, and I think it's something that not a lot of people really understand. And that's why I would like to start with saying that we need to understand that our natural systems are adapted to the current climatic conditions. But not just our natural systems, also our man-made systems, our economies, our agricultural sectors, all of that is adapted to the current climatic conditions. And what climate change is doing is it's increasing the rate of change beyond a speed or a rate at which natural adaptation can take place. And what that will then have as a result is significant consequences and drastic compromises that we need to make if we want to adapt, not just naturally, but also within these man-made systems. And where the 1.5 then comes in is 1.5 degrees Celsius was determined scientifically to be a threshold that if that is overshot for a couple of consecutive years, we will start seeing changes to the climate that is irreversible. And that will then have as a consequence the significant and drastic compromises that we need to make to adjust to that. So for instance, we'll start seeing the Greenland ice sheets melting, the Western and Arctic ice sheets melting, things that we can't reverse. It will cause massive destruction of ecosystems across the globe. It will change certain of our agricultural land. So certain areas that were previously viable for agriculture will become non-viable areas for agriculture. And that, of course, will have an impact on agriculture and also our economies. So that is what we need to keep in mind. And also what we're seeing from the climate models in South Africa is it's showing that we will become significantly warmer and significantly drier. And the problem is the current global climate change rate is twice as much in Southern Africa compared to the rest of the world. So we will start feeling these impacts even sooner and even more intensely. So we need to start thinking how we can adapt to that.
Why is it twice as fast?
It's just how the climate patterns are changing and how we are seeing more subsidence over Southern Africa, and that is not conducive to thunderstorm development, for instance, which is our main rain-producing system. And also we're seeing that some of our cold fronts are moving further southwards, which is also a rain-producing system. So that's some of the reasons why we're seeing that Southern Africa is becoming more hot and more dry compared to other parts of the country. Just lastly, I would also like to say, when we hear something like 1.5 degrees Celsius, it may seem insignificant. I mean, 1.5 degrees Celsius doesn't seem like a lot, but we need to view these temperature changes in these large-scale natural systems and what it means to them. So if we, for instance, look at the Enso circulation, the difference between El Nino and La Nina, a difference of 0.5 degrees Celsius in that sea surface temperature where we measure El Nino is a difference between an Enso neutral year and an El Nino year. That's 0.5 degrees Celsius. Similarly, a difference of 0.5 degrees Celsius is the difference between an Enso moderate Enso year and a strong Enso year. And that's how we need to start looking at these changes, not what it means to us, but what it means in these large-scale natural systems.
So realizing the seriousness is the first step, and
Absolutely.
then obviously those purposeful rather than natural over time
Absolutely.
unconscious adaptations that we need to make.
100%.
And a big part of that is obviously policy regulations put in place to help us do that, because those are the frameworks that ensure practical implementation. And then I want to come to you, Dewald, and say part of the role of the government is to cushion producers against these many natural global factors that we are facing. Sometimes they're able to do that, sometimes not so well. I think we can spend a lot of time criticizing government, and a lot of people do, but that's not the point. How do we get around that?
What I always say is, this is our industry. When the beef producers ask, but what can government do for us? I tell them it's not government's industry. Government are merely enablers to assist us in doing certain things. But there comes a point, and my wife always says, don't act surprised when a 4-year-old acts like a 4-year-old. We shouldn't act surprised in the certain circumstances where government can't help us, because we stand back and we're in awe, they couldn't do this. And we need to understand that we need to step in, this is our industry. We cannot keep on kicking the ball back to them. So from the red meat perspective, what we're starting to do is to say that, how do we look at this? How do we understand ESG specifically? And I'm referring to ESG for a reason now, to say, what does the future look like? How do we fit in? How does South Africa look? I mean, we understand that we're an inherently dry country. We're in a situation whereby, can we farm with cattle specifically or animals in a specific region? What does it do to the grasslands and the rangelands? And we need to make the decision. We cannot look to government to say, please make this decision for us. Where can we do this? And we need to come up, and that's what we're busy doing with plans to say, how do we ring fence, take these animals quicker off the veld, etc. But the plans needs to come from us. We cannot continuously look to government to give us plans. But we look forward to, obviously, their assistance in enabling us to do certain things. But the plans need to come from us as the owners of the specific industry.
So, Courtney, just as much bad press as there is often about the government, there is also about Africa. You know, you just have to think back to Trump's third world country, and you know what the global perception is of Africa. And yet, Wandile was telling us there where South Africa is the second most food secure country in Africa. And there's a lot of things that we're getting right here because we live in such extreme circumstances that perhaps have not affected the rest of the world yet. We are forced to adapt a lot quicker. What kind of resilience do you see that's already built into our models?
Yes, Annelie, I think we've come a long way as a country, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it's actually because we don't get the support that one needs, as Dewald said, as an enabling government to enable farmers. It's because of that we are so resilient. It's because of that we are so fast adopters of technology, for example. We have to be in the forefront of technology, and if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have been here having a successful and thriving agricultural industry. So that made us resilient. I think what we need to know is, as South Africa, we have built a self-regulatory system because we had to. The free market, for example. If we didn't have the free market, we wouldn't have been number 2 in Africa in terms of food security. So that's very important to things that we thought might have been negative to us was actually helping us. So now we don't have that crutch that we sometimes need. We, for sure, I think there's times where you would like insurance, for example, input insurance for our grain farmers in difficult years. But because we don't have that crutches over the years, or we hadn't had it, we are able to survive those difficult circumstances, and that's why we number 2 in Africa in terms of food security.
They always say excellence doesn't come from a place of comfort. Excellence comes from people who are challenged to innovate, to think of solutions that are not easily available to them. And Dewald, I'd like to come back to you for some examples. Before we came in, you shared some examples of Danish farmers in Zimbabwe, and I mean, I think a lot of people in South Africa think of Zimbabwe as the worst possible place. That's the lowest end of the spectrum you could go to, and yet there are some examples of excellence there. Share them with us.
About, I think, 3 years ago, myself and Johan went to Zimbabwe and looked at how does these farmers operate within a failed state, and I think what we came back with was specifically so that these guys had to take, they actually took the responsibility upon themselves to say, like I said earlier, this is our industry. As recently as about 3 weeks ago, I also spoke to some Danish farmers who actually stayed behind in Zimbabwe after all the farmers left, and they said to us in a conversation that they just kept on going. They understood that there's no way they can go back to Denmark to do anything other than be farmers in Africa, and that's where they want to be. A lot of what we saw was based on attitude and their resilience created by these difficult situations, but taking responsibility for what they had to take responsibility for. And I think the whole thing revolves around, for example, in livestock industry, going to biosecurity and looking at biosecurity and saying, it's not my neighbor's problem, it's my problem. And I think that's the attitude which these guys actually do business with in these difficult situations, taking responsibility and owning what they have to own as farmers in that specific region.
Johan, I want to come to you and look at some solutions that we're seeing globally. Trends, things that farmers overseas are doing that are working for them, that farmers in South Africa should be paying attention to. And not just farmers, but the broader agricultural industry.
I think one thing that we discovered when we went to Zimbabwe was the takeoff of responsibility, where the farming community said it's ours. It's not the governments. They play a major role. It's us. We need to do something. Before I go there, I want to come back to climate. There needs to be a trade-off on the climate concept that happens. If you want to reach net zero through a scientific way, you need to have food security. You need to have farmers being practical on how they could implement that. So if we go to the world and see what's happening in the world, one of the major things is ESG and SGDs, the implementation thereof. The first thing I want to say is the South African farmers are good with that. We are in good standing. We have fantastic farming practices. We're world-class farmers. So it's not that we're not sustainable. We are sustainable. If you think about QSure, Pork 360, Sustainable Wool Standard, it's absolutely fantastic what we do. However, there is something new in ESG, and that trend spills over to us. It's ESG, the ESG elements being implemented into finance. And we're not that used to it. So that is a major trend that's going to determine a different concept for us in South Africa. And the concept is the commodities and agriculture South Africa should put a stake in the ground to say, these are the elements for ESG for us as industries. Because that's where the conflict happened in Europe, where you have this fantastic concept of a Green Deal and a strategy farm to fork, and you sit with the farmers who are highly subsidized. And all of a sudden there's a gap between the two. The subsidy is not good enough for the adoption of new farming management practices. And all of a sudden you have this great conflict. So I think the first thing is, and that's what Dewald referred to, is to say, as agriculture in South Africa, we stand up and we take up the responsibility to say, climate change is the reality. If it's 1%, 0.5%, whatever, we can see it. And we need to be mindful of that. We take up the responsibility to say, what can we do as industries and commodities to adapt to a system that will allow us to be resilient in a very difficult time, and where we can farm climate smart. So I think sometimes the conflict is a political conflict. And as farmers, and maybe something that's strange is, we are the green parties. We are the people on the farm, farming with the crops and the livestock that might be affected and will have a great effect on climate change. We take up that responsibility to say, we want to farm in a different way. We want to go with the not the flow, but the risks that we are dealing with. And we want to be the owners thereof to say, but we're going to determine where we want to go to.
And in a lot of these trends and the ways that people react to them, you can see patterns over time, which is why studying history is so important. It helps us have some kind of an idea where we're going in the future. And cycles within cycles. Corneille, I want to come to you looking at market cycles. What are we seeing in terms of global patterns that our farmers are adopting to help them understand what the right crop is at the right time for the market, given all these global challenges?
Yeah, I think firstly, just to paint the bigger picture, I think there's different cycles, and I think there's no one than a farmer that knows cycles. But we're dealing with almost 3 different cycles currently. We've got the climatic cycle that Annika was talking about. We've got the geopolitical cycles, more than 60 countries going to the polls this year. And then we've got economic cycles that we're seeing now. And what happens in the world, everyone's talking about in 2050 we're going to need so much food to feed the world. And I must say, people said in 2020 we're going to run out of food, but we haven't. And that just shows how resilient the farmers in the world and also in South Africa are. We have been able to adopt, but we're going through, I think, a deeper cycle now economically, where we see some commodities, especially our inputs during COVID, rising, and the commodities of the soft commodities of grains not necessarily following the same way at the same time. So you get times where your inputs is at record levels, but your commodity price is low. And that's a difficult thing in a free market to go through. We talked about countries that get subsidies. We don't get it. So in countries that subsidize, like the US and the EU, they can go through cycles where their input prices are high and commodity prices are low because they get assistance, they get incentives to plant, to stay on planting. And we don't get that. But again, maybe it makes us stronger. So we just need to be able to survive these deeper cycles. But that takes planning. So you, as a farmer, you need to know at some stage you're going to go through a difficult cycle, whether it's drought or whether it's a difficult economic cycle. But you have to plan for that. So we have started with saving plans for our grain farmers, for example, to be able to save in the good years for you to be able to go through the bad years.
Would you say if you think of a circle, and Johan said at the beginning he hopes no one of us has to repeat 2024, would you say we're at the very lowest point of that cycle in terms of where those drought, market pricing and geopolitical conflict, where all of those low points converge and hopefully next year we're on the uptick, or is that a bit optimistic?
One would hope so, but if you look at all the market trends and all the economists out there, everyone's thinking that prices still needs to go down. And that's the problem. How long can you survive in a low cycle? How deep can it go and for how long? I think we've been seeing our margins in especially the grain industry getting lower and lower. So your opportunity to recover in 1 or 2 seasons gets more and more difficult. So that's why you have to start planning for these cycles. And one would hope, and I hope Annika can help us with that, but we thought this dry cycle is going to be much longer than some predict. So some weather forecasters say we might be heading in a La Nina again. But I mean, we know South Africa's weather is probably the most difficult weather to predict because of the thunderstorms.
Ek kan sien ek het jou nou baie onpopulêre vrae gevra net om te kyk na Johan en Dewald se gesig.
Die boere antwoord is, I can't care how deep we are, and if it's going to be the best next year, it's going to be my best harvest ever.
My best harvest ever.
And
Okay.
next year, tomorrow is going to be the best day ever. So we don't care how deep it's going to go. And it is tough. But the resilience we spoke about when we started is this passion to be so good. If you think where we were and how deep we needed to go, and still we do produce. And that deepness sits in passion. That's this absolutely belief system and passion that we have. 1.5. Man, we're going to give that thing a go.
Maar voor ek kan sien jy's nou op
Jy het die vraag gevra.
Maar I said before the conversation we're not going to let you carry on tangent. I see where you're going, but I want to come to you, Annika, on that point of El Niño, La Niña. What is the hope and what is the practical progression of what we're seeing with those two cycles?
That's a great question, and it's one of the best things as a meteorologist if you can forecast good news. And at least with the weather cycle, we came out of an El Niño just now. I don't need to tell anybody how bad that was, but what we are seeing with the current climatic models is that towards the end of this year, we should be entering a weak La Niña phase. So that is usually wetter and cooler conditions for our country. It's the same as what we had in 2021, 22 and 23 before our summer started.
So I'm just going to jump in there because ek is 'n totale leek as dit kom by weer. I thought initially it's sort of an average of 3 years per cycle. So we had 3-ish years of La Nina, and then we were expecting 3-ish years of El Nino. And now after a year, you're saying that's done.
Yes, so actually that 3 years of La Nina in a row, we call that a triple dip La Nina. It's not very common. That was the 4th triple dip La Nina that we've had since 1950. Okay. So it's not very common to have 3 consecutive years of La Nina. It is true that this is a natural cycle. It's a cycle that's been there before climate change, the cycle of La Nina and El Nino. And maybe I can just explain a little bit more about how that works, because it's actually so interesting. It's a cycle, an ocean atmosphere cycle that takes place roughly between South America and Australia, and we measure the sea surface temperature around the equator in that area. And the sea surface temperature is determined by certain winds that blow in that area. That's why it's an ocean atmosphere circulation. And then what El Nino and La Nina does is it determines where weather systems across the globe situate themselves. So that's why, even though it's so far from us, it still has an effect on our climate, because it determines where climate patterns situate themselves. And what we've seen is during La Nina, that is when the sea surface temperature is below average, and that's when we usually have the cooler and wetter conditions. And when those sea surface temperatures are above average, that's when we have El Nino, and that's usually the drier and warmer conditions like we've had in this past season. And also like we had in 2015, 2016, that was a very strong El Nino, and I don't need to remind anybody in the agricultural sector, it brought us to our knees. It was one of our worst maize productions in history in South Africa, and that was a very strong El Nino. But these are natural cycles. One thing I can say about climate change within these cycles is we're seeing that although we've always had La Ninas and El Ninos, now we're having more very strong El Ninos and more strong El Ninos, where before we would have more moderate El Ninos coming through. Now when it's El Nino, it's usually, or what we're seeing over the last couple of cycles, is it's becoming strong to very strong El Ninos. And the effect of that is much more on the country and on agriculture.
So we keep coming back to this resilience against these natural changes and seemingly unnatural changes. And in building resilience into our production methods, we have to do a couple of things simultaneously, which is, I think, where it gets difficult. So not only do you have to buffer your production methods financially, you have to buffer them against climate change to make sure you're sustainable into the future. You have to buffer them in terms of animal diseases. I mean, in the past couple of years, we've seen FMD, African swine fever, avian influenza decimate a lot of our livestock production in South Africa. Perhaps decimate is a strong word, because nonetheless our farmers have been resilient. But we see this theme becoming more and more important globally as export markets are dependent on strong biosecurity measures. And there I want to come to you, Dewald, because biosecurity, traceability, and this health-conscious consumer are all sort of interconnected, and farmers really have to be on their top game. How do they build resilience and adaptation into their business models?
When you mention FMD, biosecurity in the same sentence, my heart starts racing. I get goosebumps on my head.
I didn't see that.
It's too shiny.
I think, you know what the thing is? Biosecurity, the One Health idea of the interconnectedness between animals and humans is a reality. If you look at avian influenza, which is not my forte, I'm not a veterinarian, but the effect that it had on the entire world, it means, I mean, and Johan referred to it earlier, to say that globalness and the global issue is a reality. The fact that we see foot-and-mouth disease within South Africa and not by definition in other countries. The fact is, livestock comes with diseases, but it's been more. It's been more frequently, and it's worldwide. It is not only South Africa that struggles with it. We've learned to live with it, but I think the way that we need to look at it is from a One Health perspective, and the influence or the interworking between human and animals. Now, animals, specifically with regards to biosecurity, we tend to believe and want to believe that they are immune and start to become immune to certain things. But we don't know. So traceability within our world has become, on the one hand, very, very important and one of the main issues, but also a swear word. In the sense that, yes, traceability is not going to be a silver bullet. Because referring back to what I said earlier, it comes back to my responsibility on my farm, or at my abattoir, or at my feedlot, or wherever I hold livestock. It stays my responsibility. I cannot negate or transfer my responsibility to ensure that there's biosecurity on my farm, to be traceable, to understand how to farm and what's happening on my farm or within this value chain, any part of it. So for us within the red meat industry currently, there's a massive focus with regards to how do I share data? How do I create a value by being successful in ensuring that my farm is secure, ensuring that I've got the information, what's happening on my farm with regards to biosecurity. And we're shifting a little bit towards that to say, my responsibility, and I've got the ability to prove to you that I'm secure. I've got the ability to prove to you that I do more than the guy to the left and to the right of me. And through that, I think we can ensure biosecurity as a system or as a concept, but specifically I want to refer back to One Health. I think we tend to forget the interoperability or the links between humans and animals. And that's a massive buzzword currently, that and obviously the whole climate thing with regards to how do we antimicrobial resistance, for example, linked with biosecurity, because how do we tend to the animals? And then you throw the socioeconomic part in to have enough food and food security, and you balance all of that. Foot and mouth disease in South Africa, and the way that we have the strains that we have, I need to be it's a political disease. And it has a massive political effect, but yet it has an effect. That's the issue. And we need to do better.
Okay. And I think coming through here is this constant reminder that we have to put on these various hats all the time. We have to put on a hat to say we're part of the global agricultural system. We have to put on another hat to say, but hang on, this is our local context. These are the kind of issues that we are dealing with here amidst these bigger cycles. And when we do that, we also have to acknowledge that in South Africa, we have this incredibly divided agricultural system where we have producers who have been around for longer, who are more cushioned, who are more resilient. And then we have small-scale producers who are just as big a part of ensuring we have food security, but they have very little cushion and they have very little formal market access. That's not to say that the informal market is not incredibly big. I think we underestimate it. But in that schism, that duality of South African agriculture, Johan, how do we make sure that market access and market access through those tiers of formal, commercial, small-scale subsistence farming is wide enough to ensure we can adapt?
So I think the complexity of the political environment of South Africa, we sometimes tend to think the world understands this complexity. If you go to a market, it's about food security, it's about biosecurity, it's about sustainability in a different way in a food system. So their definition of where and how we penetrate the market is completely different than our political outlook when we look into this. So the first thing is, I think as agriculture in South Africa, we need to step up to say we are an agricultural society, irrespective if you're small or large.
Are you now saying people outside of this room and who are not at Nampo must realize that as well? Because that's difficult.
But the main issue is we should not separate it. What does separate us? Are we biosecure? So they opened up a new market in the Middle East. It's a fantastic, I would say, prototype, because it was just government with government. And all of a sudden the industry came and said, but we can prove biosecurity. And the market open up. The moment you open up that market, there's a sucking concept, a demand that comes. And all of a sudden, the smaller players in South Africa can also participate in the market. So if we talk about large, medium, and small, the first thing is we need to attend to the export markets we have and say we need to do it better than what we've done in the past. If you see the growth in the Asian market, it's absolutely fantastic. We need to penetrate into that market in a different way. We can't just go year by year, one commodity after the other. You need to penetrate with 3, 4, 5 commodities. They would be fantastic if you can export live meat to Asia. Again, it's a biosecurity issue. If we could solve the Middle East, we could solve that one also. BRICS is not a trade bloc. It's a forum. But what an opportunity. Just think of India. Just think of China. I could remember in the pork industry, 1 year's an annual production for pork was 1.5 days consumption for China. So what a massive opportunity we have. Africa. Corné mentioned it. We play, and we are great players in food security for Africa. So social and economic unrest is merely determined in South Africa, upwards into Africa. So how can we cultivate that market? We don't have an option, we must. We must play in that market. So if you have this more global outlook, all of a sudden you open up locally some markets. But then we should look into it out of an economic perspective and not a political perspective. And I think sometimes we're mesmerized with politics. We're farmers. We're here to feed a nation. We're here to contribute to a massive concept that's food security, not just in South Africa, but also in Africa and the rest of the world. And the moment you get that focus, you solve the issues that you kind of focus on to say, but what about the small-scale people? So there's a massive opportunity. You said something which I think is vital. We underestimate the informal market. We underestimate the informal production. We should never. The moment you look into it and you say, let's look into agriculture, it opens up your eyes. Because then there's no more commercial, there's no more small, there's no more regional division in this, no more political interference. It's about the love of agriculture and how people do it. Peripheral farming as a reality in South Africa is not going to go away. And you know what it is, farming. It's, if you're a commercial farmer, you look into it, you say it's impossible. But it is, it's working, they're there. And we need to focus on a greater objective, to pull this all into a spectrum where people can be in agricultural environment in South Africa.
I think we all get sometimes too focused on cookie cutter, homogeny. Everyone needs to be the same. Informal needs to become formal. Perhaps we need to do away with that thinking, because that tiered structure could be one of those elements that gives us that resilience that we so need. I want to give an opportunity for some questions from the audience, and then depending on how many questions we have, we can get some closing thoughts from our panel. And I see, Dieter, there is someone who's very eager right in the front here to jump in.
I'm not sure about the eagerness, but yes, I do have a question. Mankind have to do whatever we can to slow down the trend of climate change, point taken. The question is, can the world economies afford to do what should be done to slow down this trend? More at home, can the South African agricultural sector afford to do whatever we should do to slow down the trend? So that is my concern, is about the affordability of what have to be done. My second question is, what should agriculture do to utilize the assets that we do have to help with this affordability? I think it carbon credits. How can we utilize that in our favor? How do we change the perception that the natural gases of cattle is more harmful than the dung stimulated the microorganisms in the soil in our fields. So what can agriculture do? We already have a carbon tax levy on our Eskom bills every month that we have to pay. So how can we utilize what we have to help finance what should be done?
I think if we can start with you, Annika, just looking at that affordability on a global and a South African level, and then perhaps some of our other panelists can add in to say, what can we do to all contribute?
So I think that's such a great question, and there's a lot that I want to say. I hope I remember everything that I want to say. I want to start with, you mentioned carbon credits, and I think that is a very hot topic at the moment. And I think farmers should realize that there are certain practices that if they apply that on farm, they can qualify for carbon revenues. And what that is all about is two things. It's, first of all, if you can lower your carbon emissions, so if you have carbon avoidances, you can qualify for certain carbon revenues. So how that would work is if you, for instance, apply no-till practices and you are then using less fuel, you're not traversing your lands as often because maybe you are not using as much fertilizer before. You're still using fertilizer, but in lower amounts. You're traversing your fields less, so your fuel usage come down. Also, because if you apply some of the regenerative practices, you also bring down some of your fertilizer amounts, as I've mentioned before. So that's also a decrease in chemical usage that make you qualify for a carbon revenue. And then secondly, and that's something we haven't been able to touch on yet, is agriculture can actually be one of the keys to climate change, because if we start applying more regenerative practices on a large scale throughout our agricultural fields across the world, then we can use our agricultural lands to be a carbon sponge. I'm sure everybody has heard that term before. That's when we sequester more carbon from the atmosphere into the soils. And that's the second reason why farmers can qualify for carbon revenues. So first of all, it's your avoidance of greenhouse gases that make you qualify for carbon revenues if you apply more sustainable practices. And secondly, it is the carbon sequestration within the soil that also make you qualify for a carbon revenue. And as I say, not just looking at the carbon revenue, which can be an additional income stream to our farmers, but also this can be not only a way for climate adaptation within farming, within agriculture in South Africa, it can also then contribute to climate change mitigation by being a carbon sponge, using our soils as a carbon sponge. So that was one of the things I wanted to mention. And then practically what that looks like is also, we've spoken about this before, but integrating cover crops within your soils. That's something that farmers can do. And why that is important is that will not only cool down your microclimate of your own farm by having your cover crops, but that also means that you are increasing diversity on your farm. You have a root system within your soil that helps with that soil organism and that ecosystem that you're trying to keep alive and keep thriving. Because if you have a thriving ecosystem within your soil, then you also start to build up soil organic carbon. And that is what we need. We need soil organic carbon because then we also increase our water infiltration. And that's going to become more necessary in a drier climate. So there's lots that farmers can do, and it's not something too difficult or too complex, but it is very context specific. So if you want to start looking at these practices, you must see what is possible within your context and how can you start applying that within your context and for your farm. But there's a lot that farmers can be doing.
It is also, I think we have to acknowledge a process over time. It's not something
Absolutely.
people can switch to overnight, and there are costs involved.
100%.
I mean, our farmers have seen, just in terms of energy usage, switching to regenerative or alternate energy sources, there have been massive costs involved. And I think the question there is, how do we absorb these costs? Because at the moment, there's some level of we'll meet you halfway, we'll subsidize you from the government, but farmers are having to absorb these costs. I think you're all jumping, you're all
So the first thing
veering
is,
at the bit.
As a farmer, the first thing I'm going to say to you, I don't have money to do it, which is reality. So the complexity of this is the magnitude is immense. So we have a confluence of two forces. The one saying, I can't afford to do it, being a farmer, which is reality, practical, we're sitting there.
Yeah.
Then we deal with this reality to say, but if you guys are not going to do it, we can't afford not to do it. We need to enforce whatever needs to happen because the world is just warming and we're not going to be able to feed 10 billion people. So at this confluence of the point where we are, it's actually food security.
100%.
So when farmers won't be able to do it, they're going to produce less and we're going to have the opposite of what was the extent of the goals that we set ourselves. You know what I sense about this, and I think that's where we need to go to, is do we have enough conversation about this? Do we have enough conversation? I was in Europe when they had the issue between the farmers and the European Union about the Green Deal. And the first thing that got to me was, I don't think the government and the people who made the laws actually had a good understanding of what it is to farm and how we should farm. And so my first take with this is, it is a reality. And we've just heard the farmers know it. But do we have enough conversation about our goal, where we need to go to? I mentioned something about the Green Party. I think the last thing we need in South Africa is a Green Party, because we are working with the Greens.
Yeah.
We should be the Green Party. The essence of what we do is our planet. That's why we farm. We love our planet. I could remember as a boy that my father took me with and showed me the earthworms. I could smell the soil. I could remember the emotion. This is who we are. So it's not that I don't want to do it. So we need to bring it together. And I think the bringing together is the knowledge, the understanding of what is happening in the climate and what we can do as farmers. And eventually get to a point to say, how do we fund this?
Yeah.
I think the last thing we want is, and I think Dewald mentioned that when we spoke about government, is another law. Laws are not forcing change in behavior of people. It's the understanding and the responsibility and taking it up as an industry to say, we take up the responsibility of climate change. And as farmers, we know we need to change. We know that how do we do this?
Yeah.
And that is where we need to push into. We spoke about the informal sector. No law is going to govern them. So what can we do to bring a behavioral change into agriculture to change that?
Yeah.
And as the farmer side, we are passionate about what we do. We love the earth. We love nature. And we need to combine this concept.
Jy wilt gaan nou uit sy stoel uit.
Ek gaan nou spring.
Go.
We're already doing it, in my opinion. We're already doing what has to be done. But there's no measurement to which, there's no yardstick. There's no document that we can follow that's in place to say, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing that. We're already doing it. I can tell you, the cattle farmers, even the small-scale farmers, if we look at the change that they've done and the way that they look at the veld, they look specifically grazing, etc. We as farmers, and specifically commercial farming and mixed farming, are already sequestrating. We're doing it. But how do we present that? Where's the get-together for a document and say, this is what we see as our support towards climate-smart agriculture. And I think we're busy with it, but we need that frame to say, this is where we fit in.
Was that not in the agricultural and agro-processing master plan?
No, it's not in the AMP. So it's not existing currently. But we need to tell, again, not only government, to the world, what we are doing. I'm of the opinion that the processes and the projects that we have, for example, within the red meat industry, to say we assist small-scale farmers to get the animals early off the veld to ensure, we call it biosecurity, but it also influences climate-smart agriculture to rejuvenate the veld, the grazing. And at the end of the day, we're doing it. We just need that measuring stick. And we've had many discussions with the financial institutions, with the banks as well. How do we do it? We don't know. Because again, yes, although we're part of the world, we are still in Africa and we're still in South Africa. How do we do it? And to your point with regards, Johan, with the law is not going to do this. Law is not the way. We need to determine what we want to tell the world and our government with regards to climate-smart agriculture and the way that we farm.
Corné, from a grain perspective?
Yeah, from a grain perspective, it's really relevant. I think the first thing to understand is in the grain industry the past couple of years, we kind of in a short-term survival mode. And then it's difficult to structurally change your farm into a conservation agricultural system. But I think the one advantage we have in South Africa is because we have to farm with moisture in South Africa to be able to farm on dry land, we are already adopting or have adopting measurements to be able to farm with moisture, and that already brings in some of the conservation systems that you need to have in place. I agree with Dewald. I think the measurement is the thing we need to get to. There's lots of farmers that's already doing conservation agriculture, planting rotation systems and all of these good things to conserve the moisture in the soil, build up the soil carbon, And we just need to be able to measure that. There's private companies that have been able to start. They have a measurement system annually. They measure the carbon that's building up in the soil. So there's people working on it. But I think we kind of need to have a carbon trading platform. I know in the US they trade carbons, and I think we're getting there, but we're gonna, as industry and agriculture, we're gonna kind of lead the way to be able to make it a bigger thing in South Africa.
And just to draw a parallel for you, if you think back to 2020, think back to COVID, when all those cases were multiplying overseas, and we were sat here and we thought, oh my goodness, if this hits us big time, millions of cases, we are going to be decimated. And what happened? We realized, but hang on, the kind of community health structures that we already had in place to deal with things like HIV and TB at a ground level, root community level, was there to protect us, but we'd taken it for granted. And the same kind of thing is true here, where the kind of incredible communication, the network you see between agricultural organizations, input suppliers, the role they play in transferring knowledge, not just to commercial farmers, but to informal, subsistence, small-scale farmers as well. That's where part of our resilience lies, in making sure that these practices are already being adopted. So next step, how do we measure it? Is there another question from the audience? Or perhaps an answer from the audience? John, yes. Here we go, there's a mic in the front there.
So what I've seen from a financier's point of view, and I agree that the measurement and how we bring some tangibility to it is still out there. So I don't think the banks and SU got the answer either. But the point I really wanted to make is that where I see it really is working is where the farmers are understanding the risk drivers in their business. And many of these are risks, which we're speaking so much about climate risk, but whether it's water, sort of energy security, improved soil health, improved water holding capacity in the soil. These are all factors which to a farmer makes absolute sense, because he's really addressing the risk in their business. So I'm not worried about the uptake from farmers that are looking ahead, because in that understanding and how they convey that to their banker is really important as to how they're dealing with risks. And while they don't necessarily have the full answer, I think now we're starting to see good examples of where it really is paying off. The other point around the carbon credits, and in fact at Nedbank we do have a carbon credit trading desk, but how you qualify for carbon credits is a bit, I'm not the one to explain it. It's quite difficult to understand how carbon credits at a farm level could be traded into that platform. And there needs to be, I think, a lot of work done. Because my understanding, again, is that the carbon credits is not necessarily the silver bullet. That's not going to make you turning from an unprofitable farmer into a profitable farmer. However, if you're doing all these good things, and the carbon credits is a benefit on top of it, it's almost the cream on the top, then it makes absolute sense, because you're addressing your risk drivers and then you're adding the benefit of the carbon credits, you know. And I watched an amazing YouTube on zero carbon beef in Australia. It like blew me away as to what they're achieving. I didn't know it was possible, but it seems as though it is. So yeah, thank you for the conversation. Just a few comments. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Can I maybe just make a comment? What John is referring to, the risk. All of our farmers are risk managers. If you go to the European system, 50 to 80% of their income comes from subsidies. So another tax law, another carbon law, whatever you put onto it, if they comply to it, their income is still secure. With us, another law, there's no subsidy. We go back to profitability. And that's where That's where we came in from Grain SA side to say, then a farmer needs to go and adapt something differently because they still want to be profitable. If you're in a low situation and you're in survival mode, you don't go and put new practices into it because we know the earth is going to blow up. You can't. You just know you're going to blow up. So how do you do it? So we need to be clever in the way that we address this issue. Because the difference between the two is so easily taken by politicians and made to something, and then we became enemies. The vegans are not our enemies if you're farming with meat. You know why? Because the farms that they manage are exactly why the vegans are vegans. They are protecting those farms. Where's that conversation? And what John is referring back to is to say, risk drives behavior. Another law, I don't want to get out there to say we don't want another law. You need to have parameters how to function.
Jou reëlbreker.
You need to be there. But the take is just the law is not going to change behavior in South Africa. And we need to understand the South African farmer and what drives that behavior to adapt to a climate change concept. Because we know we need to have it. So risk is what we do. So if you farm, you're a risk manager. But what are the factors feeding into that risk? And that we need to change to be more climate smart.
So I want to hook on to something you said earlier, because a lot of this comes down to who is driving the conversations, because we can have these conversations here, but ultimately, who has a seat at the table? Is that question becoming obsolete? You spoke about pragmatic leadership. And I think if you look at the leadership within agriculture, we've got some incredible people. There are some incredible people leading organizations in agriculture. However, agriculture doesn't function as this little microcosm. It intersects with our country's broader economy. It intersects with government. We have to partner with government. We intersect in many ways with input suppliers who are not based in South Africa. So agriculture is global. When we're looking at pragmatic leadership for the big issues where we do need to partner with government, how are we doing? And I don't want to take this to a political conversation. It needs to be a practical conversation. What do we need to change?
Are you looking at
anyone? Anyone?
I think it starts with relationships. We have to know, although we say most of the things we need to do ourselves to be able to get it done. But for me, we still need the enablers from government. We can't talk that away. So it needs to happen. And for that, we need good relations. So what we are trying to do as organized agriculture is to make sure that the doors are open and let them also understand that their responsibility is to do the enabling work. If the policy and the regulations are there to be able to thrive, private industry will thrive.
And we have open lines of communication.
Yeah, and the first stepping stone of that relationship is trust. I mean, if we're going to bash each other in the media, meaning industry and government, the relationship will go nowhere.
Yeah.
We need to go into the boardroom, close the doors, hash it out, bash it out, do whatever needs to be done, and come out with a plan. And I think that's where we're moving towards, so that for red meat industry, for example, for many years, we've been taking government to court because they haven't been doing this, haven't been doing that, brought us nowhere. So the changes that we brought in is to say that let's start with a relationship, let's build that trust, and I can tell you the markets that we opened, Iraq, Iran, Oman, Singapore, Malaysia, recently now Saudi Arabia. It's all because of relationship and cooperation and acknowledging the fact that they are the enablers and we're the industry and there's certain things we should do.
And I think, just to clarify, the reason why red meat is so important is because also here at Nampo, many of the producers here who are predominantly grain farmers have to be diversified because they are risk managers. So red meat plays into almost every facet of farming. In South Africa, there's a knock-on impact for whatever you're doing.
Amen.
So, ek wou net vir Dewald ook belangrik laat voel.
Listen, I was a pig in my previous life. Remember, pork is also red meat. Yeah.
Bietjie pink.
Maybe just the concept on you asked the question, where are we going to go to? So we were 120 years old this year. And I went back
When
and
you say we, Agri SA, okay.
Yeah, I might look 120, but Agri-SA is 120 years old. So we went back and had a look on which companies in South Africa being involved in agriculture is more than 120 years old. It's absolutely amazing. You know what gave me this kind of, yes, they're 120 years old. If they could survive 120 years through extreme weather, extreme difficult, not being able to trade. You can name it. How much more can we do it with all the new technology we have, with all the leadership that we have? One of the main things is, in the past, COP28 dictated what should happen in Africa through subsidies. We're not used to it as farmers. We need to sit down and say, we have wonderful, you spoke about little tables all over. We just need to gather it and say, we take responsibility in South Africa for our own COP28. We acknowledge that and see that. And we have that leadership. That pragmatical leadership is vivid in South Africa.
Sure.
So if you go back into agriculture in South Africa and our history, it's passion about land, but it's also passion about leadership, who we are. If I have a look, Francois mentioned something about the young people, the leaders in South Africa, the young boere, the small ones, the young ones coming up. Just have a look at the little lighties being in lower school here, primary school, the excitement they have. We just need to kind of bring a confluence with that all into it, and that energy we need to take to the next level from where we are. So we are ready. We might not look the same as what we looked 10 and 15 and 20 years ago, because we adapted. How's it going to look like? There's not one leader standing up and say, this is the way. It's going to be
A collective.
of people being there and say, we take responsibility. And there's one thing that draws us all together, agriculture South Africa.
Ja.
Agriculture South Africa is where we're going to focus and where we're going to go to.
So met ander woorde, ons moet ook die boerepolitiek los.
Ons het nie politiek is.
I think in conclusion, we have run out of time, but such an interesting, dynamic conversation. Great to hear that we are seeing the bigger picture. We are already doing the right things. We just need to tweak it here and there, push harder, in saam staan. And on that note, I want to thank you, our audience online. I want to thank my panelists, my esteemed thought leaders. And I would like to, on that note, hand over back to Senwes vir 'n oorhandiging. Francois, as jy af kan, en dan kan ons almal vir mekaar 'n mooi handeklap gee.
Baie dankie Annelie en die panelists. Dit was 'n lekker stimulerende gesprek. So we started Agri Rewards. Dit het gefokus op die individuele kliënt en sy besigheid met ons. En ons het nou Agri Rewards Plus bygevoeg. Met ander woorde, jou eie besigheid deur jou georganiseerde landboustruktuur. So dis nie iets wat weggeneem word van jou eie rewards nie, dit kom by. En ek dink die issue gaan dat elke gemeenskap het sy eie besondere behoeftes. Een ou het baie wat sleg is, ander een het 'n sekuriteitsissue, ander een het dalk 'n ouer huis of wat ook al. En dit is hoekom ons dit verander het, waar ons die besluit maak waartoe gaan die geld wat jy verdien na ons gee die geld vir jou as boerevereniging. En jy maak die besluit. So ons gaan in hierdie paar dae, die eerste checks begin oorhandig. Ons gaan meer as R500,000 oorhandig terug aan ons boerevereniging. Ons eerste een is Hartbeesfontein. En ons is ongelooflik dankbaar vir julle besigheid, want dis waar dit vandaan kom. Maar die ding wat ek baie meer trots op is ons boere se die manier waarop hulle na hulle gemeenskappe kyk. Hulle saamstaan. Dis een ding wat julle moet onthou. Ek dink nie daar's in een van die ander sektore is daar soveel saamstaan en ja, onderlinge werk wat gedoen word in gemeenskappe as binne ons boeregemeenskappe nie. So dis vir my 'n groot vreugde om hierdie eerste check van 62 Kobus vir jou en jou span. Ek weet nie wie gaan hier almal saambring nie, maar baie geluk en baie dank.
Baie dankie.